Hi, everyone. Welcome. You're listening to the Climate Talks podcast, hosted by the Geography Graduate Student Association of San Diego State University in San Diego, California, in what is today the United States. I'm Sam Orndorff, Geography PhD candidate in the Joint Doctoral Program at SDSU and UC Santa Barbara. The Climate Talks. Do we listen? This is our very first episode, which we wanted to get out right around now in December 2024, because the annual United Nations Climate Change meeting just finished up about a week or two ago, and it was being held in Baku, Azerbaijan. So this was a Conference of Party meeting, or COP, and these COP events are really critical at the international level when countries go together to meet, talk about climate change. But in many ways, they're really tragically ineffectual because they're meant to address the issue of climate change, and they're not doing a very good job of addressing the root cause of that, which is ever-growing fossil fuel burning and extraction. So we're at an inflection point where the world seems to be coming together and able to actually have a discussion, but not a lot of substantive change is actually being implemented on the ground. And so when I'm talking about climate change, I'm going to be saying we and us and our climate, our atmosphere. And I really mean it, because the atmosphere is a global layer of air that provides life to every living thing on planet Earth, capturing just the right amount of the sun's energy, providing oxygen and other functions. So this means Earth's atmosphere is in every sense ours, as living beings who share this one planet together with all other living beings on Earth, human and more than human. In this first episode, I'm going to be giving a brief recap of what really went down in the UN meetings that were being held in Baku, give you a sort of critical stance, and I hope it's not dipping too far into cynicism. It's hard not to be cynical when we're talking about climate change. In this episode, I also want to talk about where this podcast is going to be heading. Why we're doing this and what kind of work we're building on and where we're going to be heading in the future. And actually, we developed these climate talks several years ago and have been hosting them on campus here at SDSU. We started during the pandemic, and so those were obviously virtual. Now, fortunately, that means that a lot of our stuff, all of our former climate talks are being hosted on our YouTube page. And so we're really building on that, and we want to keep this dialogue going. But as I mentioned, this is a climate crisis. And what I mean by that is that climate change or global heating, climate breakdown, whatever you want to call it, it's a worldwide, potentially devastating, scientifically well-established, and intensive shift or trend away from the conditions that had made planet Earth able to support life for hundreds of millions of years. So addressing the climate crisis means having these critical conversations. Above all else, it means preventing the burning of additional fossil fuels. And it also means altering humanity's more destructive land use, agricultural, transportation, and energy systems that are also driving air pollution, or greenhouse gases. So what are greenhouse gases? Well, they keep the planet warm, like I said, which we need. Those greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, CO2, but they also include CH4, methane, or methane, SO2, sulfur dioxide, and O3, which is ozone. They all keep the planet warm, like a greenhouse. Now, as we've said, we need these greenhouse gases to some extent to survive. Without them, we'd be living on a cold, snowball rock of a planet, just orbiting in space, lacking an atmosphere to trap heat, kind of like Mars. But we're on Earth. And what's happened on Earth since about the mid to late 1700s is this industrial revolution and the intense burning of fossil fuels to fuel our industries, to heat our homes, and then later to power automobiles and trains and things like that. It's made the atmosphere able to store excess heat or excess energy coming from the sun. So therein lies an energy imbalance. So I'm going to be using this podcast. We're going to be having guests. Later on, we'll have another event here on campus. So if you're in the San Diego area, please come. But we want to take it back to the basics and really address the root causes, talk about what's happening to Earth's land, water, atmospheric circulation, our energy systems, and we'll get more in detail to talk about agriculture and our industry and our mobility and our transportation systems, which are very heavily implicated in climate change. So redressing the root cause of climate change involves a complete upheaval of contemporary ways of being, of growing food, moving around, just existing. It's almost hard for us to imagine today in contemporary times, how do you live and go about your daily life without burning fossil fuels? Well, people had done it for thousands and thousands of years. So much of what we do today burns fuels, needlessly in some cases. But rather than growing despondent or depressed on this basis, we want to urge listeners, wherever you are, whatever you do, to take some action based on sound, just, hopeful understandings that Earth's living biophysical system connects us all. And there are a lot of different actions you can take. We'll be discussing those throughout. Earth's system comprises all of her lands, waters, airs, and the biosphere. They're intricately connected. We're going to be getting into that sort of natural history in later episodes. So I just want to give a brief background, but there are basically a lot of different actions that you can take as one person. And the climate crisis isn't just a systemic structural problem that implicates centuries of history and air and water and land pollution and colonialism and imperialism. Climate change is also a quotidian one, where the global elite, mostly of the global north or the northern hemisphere, about 5% of humans, are consuming far, far more fuels and polluting the environment far more than most of other people. So how are they doing that? Well, by driving every day, taking a lot of trips, eating a lot of meat, buying luxury products that are made and shipped afar, and even things that happen maybe once or twice in a middle-class person's life, like buying a home. That is implicated in the climate crisis because it invests in the destruction of habitats through purchasing a home within a certain type of urban development that leaves no space for nature, for more than humans. So as I said, we're at an inflection point. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to this issue of the international debate around climate change, how to deal with it, how to prevent further climate change, and how to pay for it. So later on, we're going to be discussing some of these basics that I've given you a brief snapshot of, because climate change is really a process that's been unfolding for as long as there has been a planet Earth. In geologic time, that's one of the main things that the climate has done. The climate has changed dramatically, sort of through natural processes over millions and billions of years. There are fossils of palm trees that are in Antarctica because climate has changed so dramatically, and you have the continents shifting dramatically from where they are now and based on previous positions. But what's different now is that we've taken a turn for collapse because we're still living in that industrial era that began in Northern Europe and places like England. And the key issue here is that burning of fossil fuels is very rooted in the oppression of workers and the colonization of vast swaths of land through imperialism and violent militarism. So as it turns out, environmentally destructive industry is just as involved in climate change as those violent imperial systems that we're really living in the aftermath of. So as I said, this podcast is going to be building on our previous climate talks on the documentary film People of Red Mountain, Life Over Lithium, which we made earlier this year, also on our YouTube. And we started these events to kind of get this dialogue going, to keep it going. Beginning in 2022, we really focused on having Indigenous leaders traditional knowledge keepers and practitioners as our guests, and we're going to be continuing that and building on that. So stay tuned. Now, let's return to this COP29 meeting that just wrapped up in Azerbaijan. Let's talk about why it was there, who was there, what did they actually talk about, what did they hope to accomplish versus what was the result. So the UN has been arranging these meetings for nearly 30 years. It started in 1995. These Conference of Parties or COP meetings, they've all been non-binding, except for Paris in 2015, which I'll talk about. So they've all been non-binding, meaning that there's no international police or overarching system that's going to punish or attack another country for not meeting its goals to reduce pollution. So nearly every country has met. We're talking around 200 different countries. They all set targets that they think are achievable. So there's sort of a consensus around this idea that climate change is threatening humanity and the Earth's physical systems, biogeochemical physical systems. And there's a bit of consensus there about the fact that we need to meet and address some of those root causes. So for better or worse, there's no global authority on any of this. There are international laws, but these are entirely voluntary. Nobody has the power to enforce, like, if a country is not meeting its pollution reduction targets, nobody's going to come in and invade them. So COP21 in Paris was legally binding, meaning that countries basically signed on in Paris in 2015, essentially for the first time in these nearly 30 years of meeting up, to say we're going to measure how much we're polluting, our CO2 basically. We're going to report on it, and we're going to really take efforts to reduce those emissions under this UN FCCC or FCCC framework. So the goals of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they sound great, and there's a lot to be hopeful about when we talk about the fact that finally these countries are meeting up to address climate change. In practice, though, they're not really reducing emissions, right? If you look at global CO2 emissions, just CO2, which is the main driver of climate change, it's gone up and up and up. It did go down during COVID when we had economic shutdowns for about a year, maybe two, and then it picked back up and started going up and rising from where it was before the pandemic. So these agreements are not really reducing greenhouse gases, or emissions, as they call them. So this has actually been well known for a while. And last year, at the COP meeting, which would have been COP28, in the UAE, United Arab Emirates, that was the first time in history, in nearly 3 decades, that they had actually talked about fossil fuels. The word had never been uttered. It was barely mentioned in any of these international agreements, in the documents that they produce, in these long documents with scientific studies, even the policy, the sort of policy memo version, which is much shorter, that's circulated for policymakers. The words fossil fuels, the phrase fossil fuels, had not been mentioned until last year. So that's a big deal. So I just want to give a little bit more context on why that is. How do these COP meetings work? Why are they taking place in countries that produce lots of oil and natural gas, like the UAE, like Azerbaijan? Who do they serve? And what are they actually doing? So the way these meetings actually work is that they have delegates. Every country sends a team of people who can go there and sort of try to balance and negotiate the needs of their particular country and their communities and how they make a living in that country versus what the international consensus is. Obviously, both of those things shift through the years and years, but basically what they're doing is trying to come to some sort of middle ground. Now, there are much more powerful countries like the United States, England, and maybe even China, where those delegates are much larger. They have more funding, they have more resources because those countries are wealthier. And so because of that, they're able to negotiate for a longer time period. Countries like the Vanuatu, or countries like Tuvalu, countries like the Maldives, which are all really low-lying small island states with much fewer resources. They don't have as many delegates. They don't have as much of a voice, and they're coming from a lot farther away. So these are all things to consider when they go to these actual meetings. And now they have them in countries like UAE, in countries like Azerbaijan, in order to sort of greenwash the image that these are places that are contributing to climate change, that are contributing by burning fossil fuels, cutting deals with fossil fuel industry and with oil companies. In fact, the president of this COP was kind of tricked because there were some climate activists who met with him, posed as fossil fuel fossil fuel workers, let's say. And he was kind of on record saying like, oh yeah, I'll sort of make deals with you. So on one hand, you have the president of COP 29 meaning to agree to cut further deals to extract more fossil fuels, and talking out the other side of his mouth saying we need to reduce fossil fuels. So that's a really big issue. But these UN meetings are helpful for countries that produce and burn a lot of fossil fuel because it helps them spruce up their image and whitewash or greenwash, make themselves sound more environmentally friendly without really having to do that much. And at UAE, much of the discussion really revolved around, do we need to, quote, phase out, end quote, fossil fuels, or do we need to reduce them? Now, I'll let you guess which tack countries took if they tend to produce a lot of fossil fuels compared to if they are on the side of let's get rid of fossil fuels completely and completely overhaul our energy and our mobility and all of our agriculture, all those things that contribute and burn fossil fuels. So it's not unprecedented that countries are meeting up to address climate change, to address the ozone, because in the 1980s, there were meetings that resulted in the Montreal Accord in 1987, and they actually successfully reduced the hole in the ozone layer that was largely centered around Antarctica, because they realized the global sort of international community came together and realized like aerosol sprays, just consumer products like hairspray, are really contributing to the loss of that ozone layer. So they met in Canada, they made this agreement, and it actually worked. So that hole in the ozone layer has been declining ever since. Now, there were later meetings in Kyoto in 1997, sort of semi-successful, building on that. Then things sort of take a turn in the late 90s. In Seattle, in 1999, there was this large sort of anti-globalization or alter-globalization movement, extremely diverse leftist movement that met when the World Trade Organization came to Seattle and basically shut the city down because the thought was that this World Trade Organization is not benefiting poor countries. It had a lot to do with labor rights, with the foisting, really, of industrial products into these countries, which was undermining their ability to build up their own economy and their own way of life. Cancun, Mexico also had huge protests around the World Trade Organization in 2003. So that is another reason that the climate change COP meetings for the UN have been held in sort of more off the beaten path places. They're not necessarily tourist locations or super accessible to climate activists. So it's kind of funny because they're sort of running away from the people and accountability in that sense. Now, why do I bring up the World Trade Organization? So one of the things at this most recent COP, which was called the Climate Finance COP, or the finance meeting, basically, the finance COP, the notion was that we can address climate change, help out the poorer countries who are polluting the least, yet facing the worst brunt of the impacts of climate change, by providing them with funding. Now, how do they do that? So they do that basically by getting rich countries like the U.S. to agree to send large sums of money just as direct payments, as aid, to the less developed, smaller countries. And so much of the agreement in the most recent COP was around how much would be spent by the rich countries. A lot of it came as simple aid. And these countries have been agreeing to pay around $100 billion a year total to less developed countries facing the worst impacts from climate change. Very little of that has actually showed up in their accounts for them to be able to pay for things like seawalls, to pay to relocate coastal communities, to pay for the fallout when you have worsening natural disasters. So some of that comes as aid. But in Baku, what they were really arguing over for a couple of weeks was how much are the rich countries going to pay up? The less developed countries were arguing for more. They said that scientifically it's going to cost about $1.3 trillion to deal with and sort of mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, but also to adapt. Much of the climate change we're seeing right now is already baked in. The worst impacts are already kind of on their way because the pollution has already been out there, and it's going to mostly be absorbed by the ocean, and that will help rise the level of Earth's overall temperature average. So the payments are supposed to go to these less developed countries, and then there's a lot of discussion about the fact that, well, 1.3 trillion sounds high, but it's actually not when you consider that just a single hurricane or cyclone can be billions and billions of dollars of damage in one country, in one city. So that was the thought from the sort of global south. We need 1.3 trillion. It ended up, when the COP meetings wrapped, ended up being around, I think it was around 100 to 300 billion per year, far less of what was hoped for. And the remainder is supposed to come not in the form of direct aid, just straight up cash payments, but in the form of loans that need to be repaid with interest to those institutions like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which are highly, highly criticized from the perspective of people in less developed countries and formerly colonized countries, because they sort of are predatory. And when countries have to go pay back the loans, whether it's to deal with climate change or whatever else, they often will be forced to sort of gut their social programs, to gut education and healthcare in order just to pay that loan back. And really, and from a broader context, it's important because we're talking about countries that were colonized and had much of their wealth taken and siphoned from the global south to the global north, with very little infrastructure in those countries built up in return, except for just a small number of elite. So all of these things are really related. One of the ways besides those cash payments that these countries are hopefully starting to deal with climate change is through things like investing in renewable energy, things like solar panels, photovoltaic panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles. That's a whole other discussion that we'll get to. And they also are doing things like cap and trade or carbon offsets, which have been heavily criticized too, because when you have cap and trade, the idea is we're going to cap or just sort of stop emitting so much pollution, maybe from a source of pollution such as a power plant, and then sort of we get a benefit if it's a coal-burning power plant, for example. They'll cap how much they emit, how much coal they're burning to produce energy, and they can use that sort of they will get a benefit like a tax cut or something that they can then go and trade. And that's sort of like making climate action into this marketable, monetized system. That hasn't worked so well because there was no cap, but there was a lot of trade. Carbon offsets. Now, those are the idea that any industry or country can sort of go fly private jets and keep burning fuels, but on the other hand, buy up some forest and protect it. So it's going to sequester carbon. Just, as plants breathe, as they respire, they build their tissue through sequestering carbon. But in a lot of those cases, for carbon offsets, what you actually see is that those forests would have been protected anyway. And then in a broader sense, a lot of forests are under threat and they're sequestering less and less carbon because we're having this dramatic shift in the overall climate system that Earth has been used to. And so that's a huge issue as well. Can we blow up this forest here, pave it to build an open pit mine to extract lithium for our lithium-ion batteries to charge our electric vehicles, and then feel better about that and sort of, quote, offset it by buying up some ranch land that would have just been ranch land in rural countryside, and reserving it or creating a nature preserve. How do you justify that? Well, there's ways to justify it. And so you may sense by this point that what I'm getting at is that these COP meetings, these climate change meetings, don't critique the system enough. They don't criticize capitalism. They actually see capitalism and treat capitalism and free markets for these things like electric vehicles and the financial, not physical thing, but getting some kind of tax cut or creating a market around offsets. The system is treating capitalism as a solution to climate change, not as the problem. And so that's a complete, really warp of the truth. It's a distortion of reality, which is that we can't just consume and consume and consume when we live on a finite planet. And so that's one of the solutions that you'll see people propose, whether it's not focusing on growth, so degrowth, focusing on our quality of life. Another critique is that when we have things like electric vehicles, well, there's no tailpipe, so there's no source of pollution coming from the car as there is in an internal combustion engine. But that's still a consumer product. There's still a lot of industrial activity that's required to just get that product. There's mines that we'll be talking about because a lot of these renewables, whether it's a wind turbine, photovoltaic solar panel, or an electric vehicle battery, they require a lot of minerals. So there's an intensive shift to just completely scrape off an entire ecosystem for the minerals that are underneath it, and then suppose that that's a renewable system because the electric vehicle is not polluting out of a tailpipe. There is no tailpipe. Well, the tailpipe is elsewhere. In the U.S., most of our energy is still coming from burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. And so if most of our energy is coming from fossil fuel or our electricity is being generated by burning fossil fuels, it's sort of a lateral move to say everybody's just going to have their own little personal vehicle and it runs on electric instead of fossil fuels. It still runs on fossil fuels, right? Now that's where my research is focused on, so I'm going to be talking about that later. And hopefully I've given you a sense of where this podcast is heading. So the next couple episodes we're going to be talking about land, how it interacts with the atmosphere, how the oceans and the climatological system really interacts and is deeply intertwined with the ocean, how air is flowing and how the flow of winds and global atmospheric circulation is really changing or beginning to change. We're going to talk about our energy systems. We're going to talk about the burning of fossil fuels. We're going to talk about the dire need for clean, efficient, reliable mass transit. Public transit is the answer for our mobility issues. So I don't want to get too ahead of myself. I do want to say, though, if you have a question for the Climate Talks podcast, you can email us at climatetalksquestion@gmail.com. And we've got a range of great episodes coming your way, so we're really excited to share this all with you. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time.